This section examines the rack and pinion gearbox. The rack and pinion steering gearbox has a pinion connected to the steering column. This pinion runs in mesh with a rack that is connected to the steering tie rods. This gives more direct operation. Both the pinion and the rack teeth are helical gears. Helical gearing gives smoother and quieter operation for the driver. Turning the steering wheel rotates the pinion and moves the rack from side to side. Ball joints at the end of the rack locate the tie rods and allow movement in the steering and suspension. Mechanical advantage is gained by the reduction ratio. The value of this ratio depends on the size of the pinion. A small pinion gives light steering, but it requires many turns of the steering wheel to travel from lock to lock. A large pinion means the number of turns of the steering column is reduced, but the steering is heavier to turn. Ratios vary depending on the type of vehicle. But in each case, the ratio is the same for all positions of the wheels. It is a fixed ratio. A disadvantage of a fixed ratio system is that towards the lock positions, more effort is needed by the driver. This is because the angle of the steering arms reduces their effective length, and that reduces the leverage on the wheels. To overcome this, many rack and pinion systems use variable ratio steering. The ratio is made variable by changing the shape of the teeth on the rack, between the center and the outer edges of the rack. Then as the steering moves away from the straight ahead position, the ratio, and therefore the mechanical advantage, increases progressively. As the pinion turns and moves on the rack, the gear contact point between the pinion and the teeth on the rack changes. This change in tooth contact changes the effective diameter of the pinion. Then, for the same amount of steering wheel rotation, the rack moves a shorter distance near the ends of the rack than near the center. Effort needed to turn the wheel stays approximately the same through the whole range of movement. The steering rack is supported at the pinion end by being sandwiched between the pinion and a spring-loaded rack guide yoke. This spring-loaded yoke ensures free play is eliminated between the gears while still allowing for relative movement. The rack is supported at the other end in the rack housing or tube by a bush, normally of nylon. Nylon is used because it has a low coefficient of friction and low wear rates. The pinion is supported by two bearings in the rack housing. These bearings are pre-loaded to keep the pinion in the correct position relative to the rack and to eliminate free play. A rack and pinion steering box is normally lubricated by grease. Each end of the rack is protected from dirt and water by a flexible synthetic rubber bellows attached to the rack housing and to the tie rod. The bellows extends and collapses as the tie rods move away from and towards the housing as the rack moves. On some vehicles, both bellows are interconnected by a tube so that as the steering wheel is moved from side to side, air is transferred from the collapsing bellows side to the expanding bellows side. Rack and pinion type steering gears are used because their construction makes them compact and lightweight. Their steering response is very sharp because the rack operates directly on the steering knuckle. And there is very little sliding and rotation resistance, which gives lighter operation.